Nintendo has been part of gaming longer than most people realize. Starting in the 1970s, the company has gone through countless eras, some legendary, others not as much. Ranking every Nintendo era from worst to best isn't easy. There's history, nostalgia, and plenty of personal bias involved. But that's half the fun. If you want to jump straight into the ranking, there's a timestamp on screen, but if you're sticking around, here's how I'm approaching this. I'm not ranking individual consoles, I'm ranking eras. Systems that released around the same time and shared ideas will be grouped together. For example, the Wii and DS count as one era, while the GameCube and Game Boy Advance are another. That way we're judging Nintendo on its overall ecosystem, like the games, the innovation, and the energy of that time. I'm considering a few factors like game quality, innovation, sales, cultural impact, and of course personal impressions, with game quality and my own personal opinions being the most important to my list. Also, I was born in the early 2000s, so I didn't live through the early eras, but I've spent years revisiting those classics to understand what made them so special. Even with that, I won't pretend like I can speak for people who grew up during those eras, so if you disagree with something I say, instead of just getting angry at me, I'd love to hear you explain what made a certain generation so special. And I also want to clarify that none of these are bad eras. They all have a lot to love about them, which makes this ranking just so difficult. This isn't a definitive list, it's just my take. It's literally impossible to make everyone happy with this. No one person has a wrong list or a right list. You may think my ranking is bad, while someone thinks yours is bad. Lastly, I will only be talking about Nintendo eras in gaming, nothing from their playing card or toy making days, and I also will not be including the Switch 2 since it's just not fair to judge a console that's only been out for just a handful of months. So with all that being said, let's get into it, starting with the very beginning of Nintendo's gaming journey. The Color TV game, Game & Watch, arcade era from around 1973 to 83. Now this is probably the only placement on the list I don't think will be controversial. Before there was the NES or Game Boy, Nintendo was still trying to figure out what video games even were. The arcade cabinets, Color TV game consoles, and Game & Watch handhelds represent Nintendo's first real experiment with electronic gaming, and looking back, it's wild how primitive and important they were at the same time. This was the foundation, the prequel to everything we now know, and it all started way simpler than you may have imagined. Nintendo's gaming journey technically began all the way back in 1973, when the company was still best known for making toys and playing cards. They released their first arcade machines, and early attempts like EVR Race and Radar Scope weren't huge hits, but they marked Nintendo's entry into the gaming industry, which were dominated by Atari and Namco. Then in 81, a single game changed everything, Donkey Kong. Created by a young Shigeru Miyamoto, it turned failure into triumph and introduced Jumpman, who we now know as Mario, and basically wrote the blueprint for Nintendo's brand of character-driven fun. That success proved Nintendo could compete globally, setting the stage for the home console explosion to come. At the same time, Nintendo was experimenting at home with the Color TV game line, basically their take on Pong and other early arcade-style experiences. Now, these weren't cartridges. Each system had a few preloaded variations of a single game, like Color TV Game 6, 15, or Racing 112, built in collaboration with Mitsubishi. They looked like toys, but they sold millions in Japan and gave Nintendo a valuable experience in hardware design. Remember, this was still the era when they were making Hanafuda cards, toy robots, and that wild ultrasonic love tester. Then came Gunpei Yokoi's Game & Watch line in 1980, which pushed Nintendo's reach from arcade into people's hands. These little LCD handhelds like Ball, Parachute, Octopus, and the Game & Watch Donkey Kong became their first global smash hit. They were sleek, portable, and futuristic, and each one was dedicated to a single game that challenged players to best their own high score. And the biggest breakthrough, the D-pad. That simple, cross-shaped controller layout debuted on the Game & Watch Donkey Kong and became the universal standard for gaming input. Without it, the NES controller and basically every controller since might have looked completely different. Now, the reason this era sits last on the list should be obvious. Yes, console specs aren't everything, but these games were incredibly simple, often just one-screen challenges or basic ball and paddle clones. They're fascinating historically, and they were popular at the time, but they just can't compete with what came after in terms of depth or replayability, or even notability. Gaming was far from the cultural juggernaut it was today, and the limited scope and memorable games has this era in last, but in terms of innovation, this would definitely be a lot higher. Next up is the NES, as well as the early Game Boy era. I already see a lot of 45-year-olds commenting about how this is too low, and I'll explain my reasoning, but first I want to give context about this era. The video game industry was in shambles after the 1983 crash, with confidence at an all-time low, yet out of the ashes came the Nintendo Entertainment System, a boxy little console that looked more like a VCR than a toy, but carried the magic spark the world had been missing. I also do want to say that I'm talking about the NES and Famicom here since they're basically the same system, but since I live in the US, I'm just going to be focusing on the NES here specifically. Released in North America in 1985, it saved gaming. There's no hyperbole there either, it literally restored consumer trust in the entire industry. It did so with a level of polish and creativity no other system had achieved. For the first time, games felt complete. They had recognizable characters, soundtracks you could hum, and worlds that felt alive. Titles like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid weren't just successful, but they were revolutionary. Mario defined platforming, Zelda defined exploration, and Metroid defined the Metroidvania genre. Each one showed players something games had really never done before. What really stands out looking back is how the NES balanced accessibility with depth. Games like Duck Hunt and Excitebike were fun for anyone to pick up, but then you had Castlevania, Mega Man 2, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and they showed how deep this new medium could go, and these are all still series going strong today. Meanwhile, in 1989, Nintendo took another leap forward with the release of the Game Boy. A little gray brick that looked humble next to flashy color competitors, but ended up redefining gaming on the go. The Game Boy's launch lineup wasn't massive, but it was effective. It had Tetris, which is about as perfect a packing game as you could ever hope for, and there was also Super Mario Land, which gave players a portable taste of their favorite plumber. Sure, was smaller, simpler, and a bit weirder, but it proved you could carry a full console in your pocket. Now, why is this so low? It's innovative, it's important, it had great sales. Simple reason is that I just think later generations improved in every single aspect. The NES and early Game Boy titles were revolutionary, but very simple and limited in scope, just like its predecessors, and I really just find it hard to rank it higher than generations with far more expansive and higher quality libraries. Now, I think if you want to have this higher, that's totally fine. If you value innovation more, then I would definitely have this higher. Next up is another controversial one. The Nintendo 64/Game Boy Color era from around 96 to 2001. So let's start with the big console itself, the Nintendo 64. Released in 1996, it was the company's first true 3D system. Booting up Super Mario 64 let you jump, swim, and explore in ways that just hadn't been possible before. It's easy to take for granted now, but this was the first time players had full 360-degree movement, camera control, and worlds that felt alive. Then came The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in 98, and gaming was never the same. It wasn't just a great game, it was the game, widely considered to be the best game of all time. From the moment you stepped into Hyrule Field and heard that theme, you knew you were part of something timeless. Ocarina set the standard for 3D design, storytelling, atmosphere that every other adventure game has been chasing ever since. And somehow Majora's Mask came along 2 years later and made things even weirder, darker, and more emotionally ambitious. But of course there was so much more. It was the golden age of multiplayer with Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye 007, Smash, Perfect Dark. Nintendo's decision to include 4 controller ports right on the console was genius. The NES and SNES both had 2 controller ports, and this doubled that, making multiplayer games far more accessible. Like, this is where Mario Party originated, where you could get 3 friends together and ruin friendships. Now, we can't talk about this era without mentioning Nintendo's stubborn loyalty to cartridges. It's both one of their boldest and most costly decisions. On the one hand, cartridges meant instant load times and more durability. On the other hand, they meant limited storage space, and that scared off a lot of third-party developers. Square, for example, took Final Fantasy to PlayStation, and that really hurt. The Nintendo 64 had fewer games overall, but the ones it did have were icons. Whether it's Banjo-Kazooie, Paper Mario, Star Fox 64, Pokemon Stadium, you could argue the quality to quantity ratio was higher than almost any other console generation. Meanwhile, on the handheld side, the Game Boy Color was quietly thriving. Released in 1998, it wasn't a full successor to the Game Boy, but more of a powerful upgrade, like a stepping stone to the Game Boy Advance. But even then, it played host to some legendary titles. Pokemon Gold and Silver turned the Pokemon craze into a cultural supernova, while The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons proved that 2D Zelda could still have great pocket-sized adventures. The Game Boy Color also gave life to underrated gems like Wario Land 3. Looking back, the N64 Game Boy Color era feels like the bridge between the classic Nintendo we knew and the more modern Nintendo we'd come to know. It was messy, sure, like blocky graphics, weird controllers seemingly designed for 3 hands, and an occasional camera that had a mind of its own, but it was also visionary. It was the kind of bold creativity that comes from a company unafraid to take risks. Now, commercially, the Nintendo 64 wasn't a flop, but it also wasn't one of the more successful consoles. I feel like it's remembered more fondly now, but this is where Sony's PlayStation got its start and never looked back. From my perspective, this era stands out because it captures Nintendo at its most transformative. Even as someone who didn't grow up during it, some of my favorite games came out during this era. Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and Paper Mario specifically. I feel like consoles that came after just improved on a lot of what Nintendo 64 games did, gave us better controllers, and were just more expansive. And honestly, I think this could be one spot higher. I think this and the next one are basically interchangeable for me. I think it really just comes down to what games you prefer. And while I think that the Nintendo 64 has some of the better games, I think just taking into account just the overall library of what's next, as well as it just being a little more commercially successful and leading the industry, even though I don't think those are the biggest factors, I think it still factors in. But that's going to be why I have the Nintendo 64 in this spot. Now next up is the SNES, some later Game Boy titles, and the Virtual Boy. This was from around 1990 to 1996. It kind of overlaps with the NES and Nintendo 64, and this may surprise a lot of you why I have the SNES higher than the N64, but I have my reasons. First, let me give some context. Between 1990 and 1996, Nintendo hit a creative stride that many still consider the company's true golden age. This was an era defined by refinement, where every idea from the NES generation came back stronger, deeper, and infinitely more colorful. The jump from 8-bit to 16-bit was massive. Let's start with the obvious. The SNES library is absurdly good. Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Donkey Kong Country, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy VI, F-Zero, Star Fox, Yoshi's Island, Kirby Superstar, Super Mario RPG. It's almost unfair how many all-time greats came from this one system. These weren't just sequels, they were definitive versions of what their NES counterparts were trying to be. Mario World took everything Super Mario Bros. 3 did and perfected it. A Link to the Past built a blueprint for Zelda that would last for decades. And Super Metroid, well, the game practically invented an entire genre we still call Metroidvania today. Like, yeah, the original Metroid technically invented it, but Super Metroid was what really innovated it. The SNES also marked a major shift in storytelling and atmosphere. Games could finally deliver emotion, tension, and complexity thanks to better sound and visuals. The music was no longer just catchy, but it was more cinematic. The Chrono Trigger soundtrack feels like it could play over a film. Donkey Kong Country's ambient tones from David Wise are generational. But this era wasn't just about the SNES. The later Game Boy years were thriving right alongside it, with hits like The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, Wario Land, Kirby's Dream Land 2. Nintendo proved that handheld games could deliver the same level of creativity that console titles had. Link's Awakening especially was a masterpiece, somehow managing to squeeze a full Zelda experience onto a tiny monochrome screen. I also gotta mention Pokemon, because that originated at the end of the SNES era, and that changed gaming forever. I do also have to mention the Virtual Boy, since technically it was part of this era. Released in 95, it was marketed as a 3D experience, but what it really gave players was headaches and regret. Gunpei Yokoi, the same genius behind the Game Boy, spearheaded it, and sadly it became his biggest misstep. The idea was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, and the hardware just wasn't ready to support it. But even here, you can see Nintendo's willingness to experiment, to fall forward. They never stopped chasing that next big innovation, even when it led them into some questionable directions. Now, 30 years later, it's coming back, so I guess Nintendo doesn't want to forget about it anymore, so that's cool, I guess. From a personal standpoint, the SNES era is one I've come to love through retrospectives. I didn't grow up during it, I was years away from being born, but when you dive back into this library, it's clear why it's so beloved. This is really where Nintendo grew up, in my opinion. The NES and early Game Boy titles were great and laid the groundwork for what Nintendo would become, and then the SNES just did everything better and still was a leader of the market, winning its war against Sega. And honestly, like I said, you can go with either the N64 or SNES here. I think it's basically interchangeable depending on what you grew up with or what games you prefer. If I ever remake this video, I wouldn't be surprised if I swap these. Obviously, the N64 is the way more powerful console, but I think the SNES just has an arguably better library, but it's just so close. Honestly, I wish I could just have these tied. And next up is one that is going to be controversial for probably a lot of older fans. Is the Wii U and 3DS era from around 2011 to 2017. I really wanted to have this era higher. I grew up with the DS and Wii, but really got seriously into gaming with this generation as I was finally old enough to really understand the industry. I know some people are probably mad it's so high, but like with all the other consoles, I have my reasoning. So the Wii U and 3DS era is one of the strangest chapters in Nintendo's history. It's a mix of brilliant ideas, confusing execution, and quietly some of the best games that have ever been made. It's the definition of a transitional period, like the awkward years between the runaway success of the Wii DS generation and the rebirth that would come with the Switch. Let's start with the Wii U because, well, someone has to. Released in late 2012, it was supposed to be the next big step after the Wii's massive success. Instead, it ended up being one of the company's biggest commercial failures. Part of that came down to messaging. The name Wii U made people think it was just an upgraded Wii, like a fancy add-on, not a new console. Combine that with underwhelming marketing and a confusing controller, that massive gamepad that looked like a Fisher-Price iPad, and most casual players just didn't get what it was supposed to be. But here's the thing, once you actually owned a Wii U, it wasn't bad. Yeah, sure, it was less powerful than the competition, but it was a weirdly great console. The gamepad had untapped potential, off-TV play was ahead of its time, and asymmetric gameplay in titles like Nintendo Land felt genuinely new. The system's interface was cozy, and I still really prefer this to the Switch. Like, this interface is just so much better. Its Miiverse social network was charming and community driven, and I'm still sad that it's gone. And its exclusives were phenomenal. Super Mario 3D World, Mario Kart 8, Pikmin 3, Splatoon, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, Smash for Wii U, Super Mario Maker. These are all top tier Nintendo experiences that were either ported to the Switch or started a new series that would continue on the Switch. The Wii U failed not because it lacked quality, but because it couldn't communicate that quality to the world. world. Meanwhile, on the handheld side, the Nintendo 3DS was quietly carrying the company. It launched in 2011 with a rocky start. It was expensive hardware, it had a weak early library, and a glasses-free 3D gimmick that was more headache-inducing than revolutionary. But after a price cut and a steady flow of games, the 3DS found its rhythm and became a juggernaut. Titles like Pokemon X and Y, Animal Crossing New Leaf, Fire Emblem Awakening, which saved that series by the way, Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, Legend of Zelda Link Between Worlds, Tamagotchi Life, these all defined a generation of portable gaming, and for many the 3DS has become the ultimate comfort console, something you toss in a bag, street pass a few Miis, and play for hundreds of hours without realizing it. For all of you that had a 3DS during its heyday, like this was one of my favorite things, was just getting a street pass. Like there was something about this that made it feel just more than just a console, and to this day there's a lot of features on the 3DS that I still miss on the Switch and Switch 2. Like you were able to customize your home screen, whether it was with Badge Arcade or wallpapers or music. There were fun apps, like you could check the play log, which I think was on the Wii U also, and for some reason that's not on Switch. And there's just so many fun apps, with Street Pass being the big one. And then I know I mentioned some games, but the 3DS library might quietly be one of the most consistent of any Nintendo handheld. It's got some depth with some third-party games like Bravely Default or Monster Hunter 4, has some great remakes remasters like Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D, and a lot of originality with games like Kid Icarus Uprising and Pushmo. Now speaking of Pushmo, which was on the eShop, this was the console that introduced the eShop. It was full of creative, small-scale games that made the system feel alive, and of course you could get any 3DS game on there, you didn't need to buy the physical cartridge. Now I still prefer physical media, but I think this was still a great addition. You could also play all DS games on it, as well as so many classic Nintendo games similar to the Wii U that basically had a built-in Wii and plenty of virtual console games as well. The 3DS had personality, and the Wii U had potential, even if it wasn't met. The problem is, both sides of Nintendo were succeeding in different directions. There were a lot of flaws during this period, as well with Nintendo doubling down on some frankly bad choices, like dumbing down the Paper Mario and Mario Luigi series, and the third-party support was really weak here. Now, there are plenty of great games, like I mentioned, but part of the reason I have this generation so high is because of what it did beyond just the new games. It greatly expanded Virtual Console, which was introduced on the Wii. It tried so many new ideas like Miiverse and Street Pass, which were just super fun, like I mentioned. It introduced Amiibo that just cost $12.99 at the time compared to the $40 of today. And that was also kind of where Nintendo finally modernized. Yes, the previous generations had online play in digital stores, but it felt very primitive. Most games didn't utilize this, and there weren't really updates most of the time. You couldn't even buy full games in those stores. The 3DS and Wii U greatly expanded online play and introduced the eShop. The vibe of Nintendo was also just different. They had the Nintendo World Championships, Nintendo Directs were introduced, and even though this wasn't the most commercially successful era, there was just something about it. Like, is it nostalgia talking? Probably. Like, someone's gonna say, how could I have this so high, even though the Wii U was a flop commercially? And yes, I admit that nostalgia is a part of this, and I did mention that that would factor in. I don't think it's possible to fully avoid nostalgia. Like, I'm sure someone who would have the NES or N64 higher has those high for nostalgic reasons. And honestly, I really wanted to have this higher, but trying to be at least a little objective here, I just don't think I could put it in the top 3. Now next up is the GameCube and Game Boy Advance era from around 2001 to 2006. This actually might be Nintendo's most underrated stretch in their history. It's the period where the company quietly delivered some of its best and most creative games, while the rest of the world barely noticed. Commercially, it's one of the weaker eras. Creatively, it's an absolute goldmine. And while that didn't always pay off in sales, it gave us some of the most beloved, replayed, and passionately defended games in their entire catalog. And the sheer quality of the games wills it past some more commercially successful and more innovative eras. So let's start with the GameCube. Released in 2001, it followed the N64 and was Nintendo's answer to the PlayStation 2 and the first Xbox. On paper, it had a lot going for it. Great specs, compact disc, even though they were tiny, a surprisingly ergonomic controller, still one of the best ever made, and a laser focus on gameplay over multimedia. But the problem was simple. Competition had changed, Sony was positioning the PS2 as an entertainment hub, Xbox was bringing online play and horsepower, and Nintendo showed up with a purple cube that had a handle. Looked like a toy, and in an era where gaming was trying to grow up, that didn't help. But if you actually played it, you know how special it was. GameCube library is unreal, and a lot of these games still aren't really playable today unless you have the original GameCube. Like, yes, we have GameCube on Switch 2 Online, but it's very limited right now. It's Metroid Prime, Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Super Mario Sunshine, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Animal Crossing, F-Zero GX, Smash Bros. Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, the list goes on. These weren't just great games, but they were Nintendo pushing boundaries. Metroid Prime turned a classic 2D series into an atmospheric first-person adventure that still feels ahead of its time. The Thousand Year Door remains one of the best-written RPGs ever made, and Wind Waker, mocked at launch for its cel-shaded art, is now one of the most timeless and beautiful games in its entire history. Even the smaller titles deserve love. Chibi Robo, Eternal Darkness, Custom Robo, Odoma, Warrior World, Beautiful Joe, the GameCube was filled with experiments, passion projects, and unique risks. You could feel that freedom in every release. This is also the era where franchises like Smash Bros. And Animal Crossing truly found their identities. Melee became a competitive mainstay and still has a community over 20 years later, and Animal Crossing became the chill, cozy life sim that would define the series forever. And yes, I know it technically originated on the N64 disk drive, but who actually played that? Meanwhile, on the handheld side, the Game Boy Advance was fantastic. It launched just a few months before the GameCube, and while the console struggled to find its mainstream footing, the GBA thrived. It was basically a portable, more powerful SNES. It was small, colorful, and overflowing with creativity. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire cemented the series as a global phenomenon. Fire Emblem and Advance Wars brought tactical strategy to Western audiences. Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission redefined what a handheld adventure could be. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga gave us one of the funniest RPGs Nintendo's ever made, and to this day is still one of my favorite games ever. And the Minish Cap, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, WarioWare, and Golden Sun showed off the system's incredible variety. One thing I love about the GBA era is how it kept Nintendo's retro spirit alive. You had Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, and Donkey Kong Country re-released on the go, letting a new generation experience those classics. The GBA also introduced the idea of connectivity with the GameCube, linking the two systems with a cable to unlock bonuses or even use the handheld as a second screen. Games like Final Fantasy, Crystal Chronicles, and Zelda Force Woods Adventures tried to make this work. It never quite caught on, but looking back you can see the DNA of the Wii U and even the Switch in those early ideas. From a modern perspective, the GameCube and GBA feel like an era where Nintendo retreated from the mainstream to focus on its true fans, the people who love gameplay above all else. It wasn't the age of motion controls or touchscreens or massive gimmicks, it was just pure focused game design. These games didn't need to sell 30 million copies to be remembered. As someone who grew up right after this era, like this was not my first generation, I did not grow up playing on a GameCube or a GBA. These consoles kind of feel like time capsules. This was before Nintendo had a resurgence with the Wii and DS. It's kind of like the if you know generation, just quiet hits, experimental ideas, and timeless games that just reward you the more you revisit them. So yeah, the GameCube and GBA era may have not ruled the market, but it may have the best control ever and one of the best libraries ever. This was also the last time Nintendo tried to compete with other consoles in terms of specs, so I do think that's something worth noting. Now, the Wii U and 3DS era, I don't know if I want to say it's interchangeable. I think it's very close. If I ever remake this video, this is another one that I'm just like 50-50 on, because I think while the GameCube and GBA overall may have had better libraries, the Wii U and 3DS did a lot more and innovated more, but it's just really tough for me to put the Wii U higher just because it was even more of a flop than the GameCube. There was also a lot of controversy in that era where Nintendo was kind of dumbing down a lot of games like I mentioned, but let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. So next up is the Wii and DS era, which kind of ties into the GameCube era. The Wii and DS generation wasn't just a comeback, but it was a revolution, and that was even the Wii's codename. After years of being overshadowed by the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, Nintendo did something no one expected. They stopped competing, they stopped chasing specs and cinematic graphics, and instead asked one simple question: what makes games fun again? The result was maybe the most explosive, culturally dominant period the company had ever seen at the time. The Wii U, released in 2006, was unlike anything the world had seen before. It wasn't a console designed for hardcore gamers, it was designed for everyone. The sleek white design, the Wii remote that looked more like a TV remote than a controller, the glowing disc slot, even the soft startup sound, just all felt inviting, simple, and warm. And once you started waving the Wii remote around, it just clicked. The motion controls weren't perfect, but they were revolutionary, and suddenly your parents, grandparents, friends who'd never touched a controller before, just everyone wanted to play on this. And the games, which is obviously the most important part, there was Wii Sports, which came bundled with the console and became a worldwide phenomenon, like bowling nights, golf showdowns at family gatherings, grandparents swinging virtual tennis rackets. The Wii became the console that everyone played, but it wasn't all just casual fun either. Nintendo balanced that mainstream success with an incredibly strong lineup of first-party hits. Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, Twilight Princess, which yes was also on the GameCube, Skyward Sword, Metroid Prime 3, Donkey Kong Country Returns, Smash Bros. Brawl, which gets a lot of hate, but I still loved, Mario Kart Wii, Xenoblade Chronicles, some great Mario sports games. Each one pushed creativity in different ways, from Galaxy's physics-defying level design to Brawl's ambitious crossover insanity. And then of course we finally got a virtual shop with the Wii Shop. Now, you couldn't get full-fledged games on here, at least full-fledged modern games, but it had a virtual console which brought back a lot of Nintendo classics. And then there was a lot to do here. While previous consoles were solely games, the Wii's finally started to have some more entertainment. Like there was of course the Photos channel, Wii News, Wii Plaza, and entertainment apps, which at a time where smart TVs weren't really common. Like this is something that could be used for watching videos or TV shows or movies. But now I gotta talk about the DS, which launched in 2004. And this was one of the most successful systems ever made. The concept seemed strange at first. 2 screens with one of them as a touchscreen. Because remember, at 2004, it wasn't like today where every screen is a touchscreen. Like this was something that was pretty uncommon at the time. That second screen changed how you played, turning menus and maps into intuitive tools and giving developers a new way to experiment. The DS became a playground for both innovation and nostalgia. The library was massive. New Super Mario Bros., Mario Kart DS, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Animal Crossing Wild World, Brain Age, Nintendogs, Professor Layton, Kirby and the Canvas Curse, Elite Beat Agents, Metroid Prime Hunters. It was a blend of mainstream hits and wild creativity. The DS sold to everyone, kids, adults, casual players, lifelong fans, and it became part of everyday life. This was also the first Nintendo console to have online play, and yes, it was very limited, but it still was a big innovation, and I should say built-in online play. I know the GameCube had some online games, but you had to use some sort of adapter for that. But what made this era so special wasn't just the sales, even though they were ridiculous. The Wii sold over 100 million units, and the DS crossed 150 million, making it one of the best-selling systems of all time. But more importantly, this was the era where Nintendo found its soul again. They stopped chasing horsepower and remembered what made their games magical in the first place. Accessibility, imagination, shared joy. They didn't care about looking cool, they cared about making people smile. Of course, not everything was perfect. Motion controls sometimes felt gimmicky, shovelware flooded store shelves, and online play was, let's just say, bare bones. But even with those flaws, this was the era that defined Nintendo as the fun company again, the one that can make gaming feel new to everyone, not just people who grew up with it. From a personal standpoint, this era hits home because it's my childhood. The DS was my first handheld console, and the Wii was my first home console. It didn't have the most expansive library, even though I think it was still great. It didn't have the best graphics either, it was just about fun. The Mii channel music, the little cursor hand, the sound of the Wii remote connecting, those things just stick with you, and they're still incredibly nostalgic for me. Looking back, the Wii and DS era might be the closest Nintendo has ever come to global domination, but it didn't feel corporate or forced. It felt human, like Nintendo had found a way to make everyone a gamer, even for just a moment. And this is the era that got me and so many other people into Nintendo. And finally, at number 1, we have the Nintendo Switch era from 2017 to 2025. If the Wii and DS era was Nintendo rediscovering its magic, the Switch era is when they perfected it. This is the culmination of everything the company had been building towards since the very beginning. The motion controls of the Wii, the portability of the handheld consoles, the ability to play home consoles off your TV, and it all came together in one sleek, hybrid system. It's rare that a company gets to reinvent itself twice in one lifetime, but somehow Nintendo did it. Released in March 2017, the Nintendo Switch felt like a breath of fresh air, or I should say a breath of wild air, not just for Nintendo fans, but for gaming as a whole. After the confusion and disappointment surrounding the Wii U, the concept was immediately clear. Play anywhere, anytime, with anyone. In an industry obsessed with specs and cinematic realism, Nintendo focused on versatility and fun once again. You could dock it for the TV, pop it out for handheld play, or even prop it up with its little kickstand and share a controller with a friend. It was the natural evolution of everything Nintendo had ever tried, and this time it actually worked. The launch lineup made that very clear right away with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which wasn't just a great game, it was a generation-defining masterpiece. And yes, I know it's on the Wii U, but most people remember it as a Switch game. Its open world reimagined exploration itself, blending freedom, curiosity, and wonder. Then came Super Mario Odyssey, Smash Ultimate, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which just improved upon the great Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U, Animal Crossing New Horizons, Splatoon 2 and 3, Metroid Dread, Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario RPG Remake, and just so many more. It's just a run of back-to-back-to-back hits that turned the Switch into one of the strongest libraries in gaming history. Some of the best games of all time are on the Switch in my opinion. What's especially fascinating about this era is how Nintendo finally unified its audience. No more dividing energy between a home console and a handheld. The Switch is both, it's just a true hybrid. That move not only simplified their development process, but also gave players a consistent platform. Suddenly, handheld fans who loved the DS and 3DS didn't feel left behind, and console players got the same great experiences on the go. Games like Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Luigi's Mansion 3, and Pokemon Legends Arceus all benefit from that unification, each one feeling equally at home on the couch or in your hands. This era also saw Nintendo embracing digital storefronts and indie developers like never before. Yes, the eShop existed before, but on the Switch, the eShop became a goldmine of creativity. From massive hits like Hades and Hollow Knight to cozy favorites like Stardew Valley and Celeste, the Switch became the console for everyone, in every sense of the word. The family machine, the indie hub, the JRPG paradise, the nostalgia box, is you could play tons of classic Nintendo games here with Switch Online. Whether you wanted to replay Super Metroid on Switch Online or dive into something brand new, the Switch absolutely delivered. From a cultural standpoint, this is the most globally beloved Nintendo era since the Wii. The difference is that this time, the love came with universal respect. Critics, players, and developers alike recognize the Switch as something truly special, not just a novelty, but a legitimate pillar of modern gaming. The system has sold over 140 million units and counting, and I believe recently it actually surpassed the DS, so it might even be higher, and it managed to stay relevant for 8 years, even as technology and trends change around it. Like, that longevity says everything. We've never seen a Nintendo home console last for this long. The only reason it's not as relevant anymore is because its successor came in. Like, look at the NES, it was around for 6 years, SNES 5 years, Nintendo 64 5 years, GameCube 5 years, Wii 6 years, Wii U 4 years, and then the Switch for 8 years. And usually at the end of Nintendo's console lifespan, it's just tailing off. Like, the Wii U and Wii both fell off heavily towards the end, but not the Switch, it was still going strong. From my perspective, this era feels like the one where Nintendo finally became timeless again. Now, like I mentioned, I grew up during the DS and Wii days, but the Switch just felt like the ultimate Nintendo system. Being able to play Breath of the Wild on the go when it's a full home console game, or Battle Friends and Smash Ultimate is truly amazing. Yeah, handheld consoles have been around, and I used to play 3DS games with friends, but it's not the same as a full home console game. This also led to a revolution of hybrids in the gaming industry. Of course, the Steam Deck, which is basically like a Switch that plays Steam games. Now, PlayStation and Xbox have both made portable devices that allow you to play games off the TV. Of course, it hasn't been perfect. Nintendo still has struggles with things like online infrastructure, voice chat, which finally got a real improvement on Switch 2, and sometimes, and let's be honest, their pricing decisions, which is even more of a Switch 2 issue. But when you look at the big picture, the Switch is one of the most complete, consistent, and joyful systems ever made. It took Nintendo from a sort of dark age to maybe their most successful era ever. They've gotten much more third-party support as well, and have brought in a lot of non-Nintendo fans into their ecosystem. You may say it's recency bias, but I truly feel like this is the most complete Nintendo era. Just unified this fan base, brought so many great games, brought third-party support, and really changed gaming forever. And that's the list. I know this is something that's going to be very controversial. Like, there's no one correct order like I mentioned. A lot of these I'm still unsure about. Like, I don't know maybe if I should put the GameCube lower, if I should have the SNES higher, if I should have the N64 higher. And my mind could definitely change over time. Like, if you comment trying to convince me why a generation may be better in a respectful way, I might listen and be more willing to change my mind. And remember, this is all for fun, and if you're a grown adult and you're getting mad over someone who's just giving his opinions over video game consoles, you're missing the whole point of this. I'm not saying any of these eras are bad. I think all of them are great and have something to love. And it really comes down to just when someone grew up, what type of game someone likes, what someone values in an era. Like, maybe you value innovation more, maybe you value online play, maybe you value being able to use the console for more than gaming, and maybe you just value the games themselves. It really just comes down to whatever you find important, and don't let anyone tell you your list is wrong, because remember, this is just all for fun. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and like, and also consider joining my Discord and becoming a channel member for just a couple bucks a month. I have a bunch of other videos on here that you may be interested in. You can see here in the end screen, or check out my channel. Thank you for watching Domainy, and I'll see you next time.